I hope everyone is dwelling in the joy of sharing our knowledge and that we're going to have exactly the outcome that we hope for from this conference, to have people with knowledge sharing it with each other, to make sure that all of the stories are heard. And we have the good fortune to have placed the previous presentation and this presentation right next to each other. Grandson of William Paul, Ben Paul, is here. Ben Paul is here to share information about his family's history. Gratish.
Well, it's been an interesting conference so far. This is my fourth sharing of knowledge conference, and each time I've just shared on Paul family history. And last time was on the history of the Teton Raven Hat, and this time will be on my great-grandmother, Tillie Paul Tamaree, Katliud. Gita Ha. And I was wondering how to tie this all into climate change. And as I was listening to my cousin Mita and her presentation, she ended with a word that kind of set me thinking and tied it together for me. That was the word migration. And her meaning was that we're in the middle of a migration. And I don't know if we're in the middle of it, we're probably at the beginning of it, but there are a massive amount of people moving because of climate change. And yes, there's people moving in Alaska, but if you look down to the south end of this continent, there's going to be 20 million people coming our way, and because they're going to be underwater. And there's been a lot of talk about floods and that, and it'll happen. And there's been other migrations, though, that have happened to Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people. Yes, we've moved around ourselves, as we speculated on for the last hour or so, but the big migration came to us. The Europeans migrated, and they came into our territory, and we survived it. And Tillie Paul was right in the middle of it. Born in 1860, she was in Wrangell, and I'll be getting into that. But first, I need to I have a lot of family members here, and they all know me, and they know the lineage and everything. And my name is Ben Paul, and Kunachnesti is my Tlingit name. Teton, Raven Clan. Forgive my old-fashioned pronunciation of some of the words. I tend to spell and say them the way I heard my Uncle Fred and my father and grandfather say and spell them growing up in that family. My father was William Paul Jr. Suuk-ish was his name. He goes by William Paul Jr. So there's a little confusion. We got way too many Williams and Francises and Matildas and all in the family. But he was also a lawyer, and his father was William Lewis Paul, or William Paul Sr., who, well, the archives are named after him over in the Sea Alaska building. And he was also a lawyer, and his mother was Tillie Paul, or Matilda Kinnon she was born into the world as. And she was also Teton, Raven Clan. There are parts of this that I'm going to go over pretty fast, and some of it is common knowledge. I find that it's better to really look at something seriously and with more depth in order to get at the root of what Tillie Paul was like, what she went through back in 1860 and all the way to 1952. And I will refer to Matilda Kinnon as Tillie mostly, because that's the name she went by for most of her life. She said that one of the first memories that she had was of the end of the Civil War, which means late 1865, and she's 3 or 4, maybe 5 years old. So we don't know exactly the year she was born. It could have been as early as 1860, and it could have been in Wrangell. Her mother was Kathook, who was Teton, and she married James Kinnon, who was a Scotsman working for the Hudson's Bay Company, which was stationed in Wrangell at the time. They were leasing the fort from the Russians still at that time. But he got restationed down to Victoria, and Kathook came there, and she was taken away from her village at that time, all the way 600 miles south to Victoria, where, the support system was pretty much gone for her. She had 2 daughters, and Margaret was her older daughter, 2 years older than Tillie, and she became ill. The coughing sickness, TB, and James Kinnon, he had to do something. He had this idea that he would send his daughters home to Scotland. Well, you know what that went over like with a Klingon mother. That wasn't going to happen. But he had to do something because she was sick. I think he saw that his wife was sick, and what was he to do? Well, it could be that he just let her go. He just took an opportunity to have her go back to Wrangell. And at this time, a Teton brother helped Tillie take a canoe. It was probably not just 4 of them in a canoe. It was probably a trading canoe that had come down from Wrangell. Anyway, they made it back to Wrangell. And I'd like to read something now that William Paul said in his 1972 acceptance speech at Whitworth College for his doctorate, his honorary doctorate. And it kind of puts this Teton brother in perspective for me. And there's actually a recording of this speech that he gave. After listing about 10 things of note that he accomplished in his life, he said this: "There are many other things that I could mention, but you asked that my narration should be short. I have been able to supply the knowledge and various skills and devotion necessary for many things that have upped the material and spiritual welfare of my people. I attribute the labyrinthic course of my life to the following. There is a great power called by various names by all people, who has a purpose in creation. And when he needs a man to implement this purpose, lo and behold, he or she is ready. Call it predestination or fatalism, as you wish. While I can look back in the pages of history for proof, it becomes more impressive and more wonderful when I take the proof of my own life. For all my plans have been set aside, and I am where I am and sort of pushed into what I'm about to relate. Within the span of my mother's life, 1863 to 1952, she was the first female elder of our church and is known as Tillie Paul, and in the service of our Presbyterian church for 70 years, widowed by an accidental death of my father, Louis, a lay preacher. Tillie, Katliud, was to be married to a Tsimshian whom she had never met and was more than twice her age. She escaped the unwanted marriage after prayer to her unknown God, made her first prayer to this God in a commercial jargon, Chinook. Sheltered by a Methodist missionary and returned to her home to find A.R. MacFarlane's home for girls. Everything that happened to her and to me seems like a miracle. Because of her, I was raised in the Presbyterian Sitka training school and unknowingly became a Christian and made that fact known to the world when I was 16 years of age at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Carlisle Indian School. At Sitka, I came under the influence of several wonderful men and women, and as I look back today, I see that they shaped my life. I didn't know it, but I was being led in preparation for which I regard as my life work, namely, a missionary in the field of law for a primitive people who did not need another preacher, but did need a lawyer. At Sitka, I became the bosom friend and playmate of a number of boys and girls with whom I was to be joined by the great Creator in the work which is credited to me, when actually I was only the errand to their collective motives. When I returned to them from Whitworth and 10 years of business experience, they had reached the area of inquiry, knowing that things were wrong, but not what, and lacking a guide. And so the Creator works in all things. And when God needed a Teton man to escort Kathuch to her and her two daughters back to their home village, there he was. Back in Wrangell, Kathuch found help from the Teton and their friends, the Nanya Ayi. Let's show that picture of Tillie's pole. And this next quote is from Tillie's memoirs, which were given to her daughter-in-law, the wife of William Lewis Paul. Keat Dak was her name. She was adopted in to the Nanya Ayi, but not native. Snook gave a potlatch and dedicated a totem with raven on top. Both girls were placed on a huge pile of blankets. Tillie got a frog blanket and a marten skin fur robe. She didn't remember what Soonkla got. Soonkla was her sister's name. All she remembers was sitting on blankets and looking at dancing, whirling people below. The feast lasted a week. It washed out the stain of the white blood. Her mother did not allow a libret placed in her lower lip. Tillie was given a man's name. She couldn't say Katliud, so Gita Ha or Kata was her name. After Kathuch died, Gusk, chief of Teutons, came to Snook. He wanted the girls. He agreed to giving up Soonkla, Margaret, Tillie's older sister. Gusk could have asked before, The girls would always be Teton, but after solemn councils, Snook kept Gita Ha. Soonclaw went to the Teton house. Once, a ship captain tried to take the girls away because he said they must be white girls. And for years, Snook never let Gita Ha out of his sight. Snook is the brother to Chief Shakes, Nanyai. Kathook did not recover from her illness and died within a year of her return to Durango. Again, quoting from Tillie's memoirs. Kathook lay on furs. Terrible coughing and bloody foam came to her lips. Snook's household went to a feast where there would be rum. I did not edit the the memoirs here. Left Gita Ha home with slave. Kathook, heaving, breathing, slave went for help. Gita Ha went to her mother. Her mother tried to pat her on the hand. Tillie held her hands until they turned cold. Tillie crept away to the storeroom, hid, shivering, behind a box of food until Snook came for her. And then Tillie gets sick. Young Gita Ha was sick enough to cough up blood, and the shaman, Shaquindi, was called in. We do have photos of this shaman's necklace, and I know some people are undecided about whether to show shamans things or not. This shaman's necklace and spirit catcher have been in the Paul family for over 100 years, and we need to cover a little bit of history about it. Young Gita Ha was sick enough to cough up blood, and the shaman Shaquindi was called in. He put the necklace and spirit catcher around Tillie's neck and said his words, "This child would not die, but have a long life and children." Put the necklace on. And at this time, I would like to kind of set Tillie to the side and just cover the history we know about the necklace. And then we'll get back to Tillie's. All right, this next document, which I will just read, is found in the Special Collections Library at the University of Washington, where William Lewis Paul put 25 boxes of his files in about 1976, a year before he died. I live close to the UW campus, and I visit there quite often. The 25 boxes of files is quite a lot. There's also about 5 boxes of Fred Paul's stuff there and another 5 from my father, because they're lawyers and they just keep everything. You know, they keep records of everything. This is the other archive of his files is at my house, and that's about 50 boxes of files, including a 300-book collection and about 6,000 photographs, which were mostly my father's photograph collection. They named just a brief parenthesis here. They named the archives after William Lewis Paul, and we're really thankful for that, and very appropriate. But you know, there is another archive of the William Paul files and thinking and deeds, and that is located in you and me, and it's the real important one. What are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with this knowledge? It's not just paper. It's not just books and names. It's something that you can use to change your life we can all make our lives better. Okay, Indian doctor fight. Oh, there it is. The Indian doctor fight was part of the intertribal warfare between Sitka and Durango. The shamans were prophetic scouts by means of their spirits. They could warn people of impending wars. In this war, Ixtlain, big doctor, that was Shaquindi's uncle, intervened to save Ixtlain, big whale killer, Matilda Paul's grandfather. Ixtlain said that he had met the Sitka Icht. He had been warned not to fight, but he did anyway. He went through all the contortions of fighting on this occasion. It took place in front of the fireplace with lots of people watching. The Sitka Icht first took the form of a raven and hid in a funeral box. Then Ixtlain said he's a witch. Then he took the form of a big salmon and hid it in a deep box in a big lake. Third, he took the form of a devilfish, and this time he was getting the best of Ixtlain. And he had the wrangle Icht down and was choking him when Ixtlain came to his aid. With his spear, he overturned a rock at the fireplace and impaled the devilfish. The spear swayed back and forth before the eyes of the watchers, just as if in the clutches of an octopus. Finally, Ixtlain said, "I've got him." And he held the spear until the struggles ceased. Then he took the devilfish, skinned it, and hung the skin on a line. The line sagged. Then he took his yeast skinning knife and scraped the skin and threw the scrapings into the fire, which blazed up as if fat were burning. And this all happened in a pantomime. At that time, Ixtlain had on the necklace of bones, which we have in the Paul family today. The spear which he carried was sold by grave robbers. I'm still quoting from a William Lewis Paul document now. Ixtlain was buried inside Nesbitt Reef on a high point. The grave was found by hunters and robbed. Tillie Paul Tamaree heard that some Indian doctor things were being sold by white men, so she went after one of them. He denied it. But later, she found a shoebox of things before her front door that had come from this grave. They included this doctor's necklace, and a stick or baton made of yew wood, which William Paul used as a music director's baton a long time. It was burned in the Goldstein fire. That would be 1939 Goldstein fire here in Juneau. There's a little other note on this piece of paper. Emmons asked an Indian doctor, TPT translating, Tillie Paul Tamaree translating, where he got his power. He said the power came from the air, land, or water. The power from the ocean is just like the wind. And one last note, Frank Price's uncle, that would be not Frank Price Jr., but his father, his uncle, was the Sitka Icht that took part in the above fight. In 1919, Frank made a speech not mentioning any names. He told how an Ikt had a fight with another Ikt. The doctor said he was ordered to stay inside, but after a time he opened the door and someone on the beach shot him. They didn't know who. This was coincident with the Wrangell fight. Now, the intertribal war between Sitka and Wrangell, it went on for many years. As a matter of fact, Kuthook's first husband, whose name was Kuklein, was killed in 1852 in that ongoing feud. I'm not going to get into. There are accounts of the feud, but I'm not going to get into that. Just suffice it to say that there was an imbalance of the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth law, which is the basis of Klingon law and really all law. Things got out of balance, and there was an ongoing failure to set things right. It ended this way. The peace treaty between Wrangell and Sitka natives. This is also in the archives in the UW library. Town of Wrangell, Territory of Alaska, United States of America. This writing is to witness that during the first week of November in the year of our Lord 1918, that delegates from the Sitka natives came to Wrangell and met with the Wrangell natives at conference held. And in view of their Christian teaching and in obedience thereto, it is agreed between the natives of Sitka and the natives of Wrangell that all differences arising from old-time wars and battles be set aside, and that all injuries and old-time debts arising therefrom be forgiven and as far as possible forgotten. We, as witnesses thereof, do hereby set our hands and seals, pledging perpetual friendship between the natives of Sitka and the natives of Wrangell. And that's it's quite a list of names here. James Jackson, Anna Hoots, Augustus Bean, Jim Boyd, Alec, Andrew, Peter, John, and from the Wrangell side, it's Charlie Jones, who we'll talk about again before the end, William Tamaree, George Shakes, Chester Worthington, John Bradley, and Sitka replies. And this was probably where Frank Price gave the speech that about the Ikt. We the Stickeens, we the Sitkans, through the influence of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, being desirous of strengthening, if possible, a better understanding between us and to make real and lasting peace, to settle all differences arising from old-time customs and old-time wars and battles, to forgive all injuries and old-time debts arising therefrom, and to arrive at a better understanding between ourselves after hearing the foregoing peace treaty read to us, desire to participate in the above treaty of peace between the Wrangell natives and the Sitka natives, and desire to sign our names hereto for all the Sitkans, in witness of whereof, at the request of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, we Sitkans as a whole ratify the above peace treaty, and for that purpose attach our names to this amendment on the 11th day of December 1919. And again, it's quite a list of names. There are many differences between shamanism and Christianity, but one of them is not that one believes in a spirit world and one does not. They both believe in the unseen world and spirits. And for the Christian who believes his sacred literature, his Bible, He is compelled to believe Jesus when he had encounters with angels and demons and even human beings long since dead. For the Christian, it is a war between principalities and powers. If you try to take the unseen out of Christianity, you've pretty much gutted the whole religion. Every Christian who believes is promised to have the Holy Spirit living in them, the Comforter. The question is, which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones, and which ones do we want? Anyway, I wanted to include that part about the closure there of that feud between Wrangell and Sitka, because it is all forgiven. Okay, back to Tillie. The MacFarlane home. Set the stage here in Wrangell a little bit. 1861, the Stickeen gold rush. I say Stickeen and not Stuckeen because it was a bunch of white miners, and they probably said Stickeen. I don't know, but 1867, the purchase. The United States purchases Alaska. As they thought, they ended up having to pay a lot more later. You know, that $7 million didn't really cover everything, and long about 1971, they had to cough up another, 960 million and 44 million acres of land. So worked out a little bit better than that original deal. You know, Washington State is 42 million acres. Just to try to give you a relativity there. In 1869, William Tamaree, 10 years old at the time, he's living in Wrangell, and he tells a story about the first Christmas in Wrangell, and it did not go well. I'm not going to take time to read that story now, but it led to the U.S. Army bombing Wrangell, and Tillie remembers being told to get on the floor. And in 1872, the Kaiser gold rush. That was a much bigger gold rush than the Stickeen gold rush. And Wrangell became filled with miners, and poor Snook. I have 2 sons. I don't have any daughters, but if as a father, I just go, how could you live in that situation with all these miners coming in, and you've got an adolescent daughter, and well, Tillie was tall for her age, good-looking girl, in the middle of a town of white strangers, miners, with nothing they recognized as law. Because when there was a little bit of Russian law in Wrangell at the time, but they left and was replaced by a little bit of Army, but not much. So nobody to enforce the law. There's a chapter in Gita Ha called Changing Times. And remember, the book Gita Ha is Tillie's life story. And the book was intended to be, next slide. Next one. Yeah, stay there. The book was intended to be read to grade school children. Tillie came to her daughter-in-law, Frances, who was a school teacher in Southeast Alaska. Sorry, I'm looking for Marie Olson because Marie Olson was one of her students. I don't think she's here right now. Yeah, she's. We have a school pictures, and there's little, 6-year-old Marie in the picture, and she says, "Oh, that's me. That's my older sister." It was kind of nice, but the chapter "Changing Times." If we were writing today a children's book for today, you probably wouldn't put that in there. And I'm going to read most of the chapter. Because it's just, I'll just read it. The Changing Times. That winter there was trouble in the village of the Stickeen. Before the ice had formed, some white men with gold in their pouches came down the Stickeen River and built cabins at the end of the Indian village. They took some Indian girls to live with them in their cabins, but did not ask for them in an honorable manner. When one man tried to talk to Gita Ha, Snook was very angry. He wanted to kill the white man, but he felt the power of the changing times. The head chiefs of the 10 great houses of the village held many solemn councils around the center fires, but they could do nothing but talk. Over on the edge of the ocean at Sitka, where the Russians had built their stockade, the Boston men now had gunboats and soldiers. No one knew when a gunboat might come to the Stickeen village, and whenever a gunboat sailed up, soldiers with guns came ashore. The captain of the gunboat called the chiefs together and said that wrongdoers had to be turned over to him for punishment. He said that the Boston men had now bought the country from the Russians, and the chiefs of the great houses should no longer determine the punishment of their own households. The Indians no longer dared to demand a life for a life from those who had insulted them. Only the captain of the gunboat had the power to punish, and all the people had to obey the white man's laws, or they would be punished. Whenever the captain sailed away, he had one of his big guns fired in their honor. But they all knew that it was a warning to obey. Snook did not know what to do. He respected the captain of the gunboat and feared the power of his soldiers. But the white men living at the edge of the village were not like the captain of the gunboat. Snook wished that he still had the strength and fire of his youthful days. One afternoon in December, just before the early dark, Gita Ha and Sunkla were playing across the bay outside the Teton house. On the ground, snow lay about a foot deep with a hard crust on top. The girls were amusing themselves by stamping through the hard crust in a sort of follow-the-leader game. Through the gray dusk, they saw a small canoe draw up to the beach, and a man and a woman came to them over the white snow. Which is the house of the great raven? The man asked. Where the tall raven pole is, Sunkla answered. This also is a raven house where the Teton live. And over there is the Kiksadi house. You will be welcome there also. Both the man and the woman seemed very cold and tired. They looked longingly at the nearby Teton house, but turned and trudged through the snow to the great raven house. They have come a long journey, Gita Ha said. It's hard to travel in bad weather. See how tired the woman is? She can hardly walk. They watched the strangers until they reached the great raven house and then went on with their game. Later that evening, the chief of one of the smaller raven houses came to see Snook. The two old men talked together in low voices for a long time. Gita Ha could see that they were troubled. After the visitor left, she went over to Snook and sat down beside him. What is troubling you, Father? Has it anything to do with the strangers who came to the great raven house this afternoon? Snook called his household together. The strangers who came to the raven house are kinsmen of the chief. The young man and woman both belong to the Raven clan. and they have married each other. They have fled from their own village and are asking refuge among the Stickeen Kwan. Everyone sat as though carved in stone. The strongest law of the Tlingit people, a member of the Raven clan must not marry another raven. A wolf must not marry a wolf. It was though a brother had married a sister. No one spoke for a long time. A young man from the Great Raven House came to the door. Our chief is calling a council at his house and wishes the help of your advice. Snook stood up and shook his head grimly. Tell your chief I have no advice to give to the Raven clan. He knows how a chief of the Wolf clan punishes one who breaks the law. Gita Ha shivered. She looked at Snook in wonder. Where was the kind father she had always known? This man looked so grim and fierce, filled her with fear. She remembered an old story that her foster mother had whispered to her long before she was born. When Snook was still a young and vigorous man, his niece had left his house to run away with one of their own clan. Snook had followed them and brought back his niece. In the presence of his whole household, he had condemned her to death, and having broken the Tlingit laws, he took her out with him in a canoe, but returned alone. No one ever mentioned the name again in his presence. Gita Ha shivered. This was the first time the story had ever seemed real to her. Late that night, the chief of the Great Raven House himself came to Snook's fireside. All evening, while the council met to determine the fate of the young people, Snook had sat alone, silent and grim. The women of his household had not even dared to offer him food. The Raven chief sat down beside Snook, took out his box of tobacco, and offered it to him. The two old men smoked in silence for some time. Then the Raven chief spoke. My Kani, brother-in-law, my head is low, my grandchildren have broken the law. I have grown old and weak. The power of the white man is strong. I cannot fight the white man. So the guilty ones will be protected in your house because of the law of the white man is stronger than the law of the Tlingit, answered Snook. What does the white man care about Tlingit law or Tlingit honor? It has always been the Tlingit law that a brother may not marry his sister. It is true that the law is an old one, the Raven chief said. It's so old that we don't know its beginning. We Tlingits have many customs whose meaning we do not understand. And this law of the clans is such a one. We understand that a brother may not marry a sister, protested Snook, but there is no blood relationship between the young people, countered the Raven chief. It is still the law that they may not marry. The old Raven chief stood up and drew his blanket tightly about him as he prepared to leave. We have held our council and we have decided the times are changing. The white people are among us to stay. And if we break the law, the white people, the captain of the gunboat, will return with his guns on our village. Then the blood of our children and grandchildren will be on our heads. How can the Tlingit fight the gunboat? We do not know, but perhaps the law of the white man is better than our law. We are willing to try the white man's way. The young people will have a home in my house, that is all. Snook smoked another pipeful in silence, and the Raven chief had gone. Then he spoke to his family. If these people had not been willful, this trouble would not have come on our people. Let all within the household beware of bringing disgrace to our name in this manner. Gita Ha knew that Snook would never forgive one of his young people, who had disobeyed the law of the clans and brought terrible disgrace to his name. I don't think I would put that in a children's book of today, and it points out a problem that I have with researching Paul archives, and that there's a lot of things like this. I mean, this was a published book. It sold 20,000 copies and still gets used by academics who have Tlingit children that they want to teach. But I don't know what they do with this chapter. I'm sure that by this time, circa 1873, Snook was getting a little desperate about Tillie. She was still too young for marriage, but an opportunity presented itself to get her out of Wrangell. A marriage to a well-to-do Tsimshian was arranged. Tillie wanted nothing to do with it, but she dared not refuse. I read that Changing Times chapter to try to give you a state of mind for what Tillie was about to do. She finds herself alone in Tongass, a country foreign to her, no friend. She was in Tsimshian land. She did not speak the language. They spoke some English there, but she remembered almost nothing from her early childhood of English. She knew some Chinook, the trade language of the time. And she was asked to stand up to these strangers and say yes or no to marriage. And she did. She said no. Well, she had already been paid for by this man generously, as was the custom, and it's a good custom. They entered the missionary Crosby, who was in Port Simpson then, and he says, well, she can have refuge in with my wife and I until she can decide what to do. They did not even know that her name was Tillie. They called her Sarah for, I think, about 3 years. And there is a lot more to this story that time in the Crosby home. But we're going to move along. When Snook finds out what has happened, that his precious Katliud is doing laundry and menial labor at the house of a missionary, he is distraught and does not know what to do. They won't send Tillie back for fear that Snook will just marry her off to somebody else. And then along comes Sheldon Jackson with Amanda MacFarlane in 1877. And the account of how they came to Wrangell is, it's almost funny. Sheldon Jackson talks Amanda MacFarlane into this coming to Wrangell as for a very worthy ministry, and then he just leaves her there. The only white woman in Wrangell. She does not speak Tlingit. And then he goes off to do more mission work. But she was a woman of great faith and love. And fortunately, there was a Tsimshian Christian named Kla who was just starting an informal church in Wrangell. And when Sarah Dickinson heard that there was a missionary in Wrangell, she picked up everything. She was 100 miles up the Stickeen gathering berries with her family. And she came back to Wrangell. Sarah was a Tlingit Christian and bilingual in English and Tlingit. And now a course of action becomes clear, I think, to Snook. It's better to have his beloved Katliud back in Wrangell, close to him, even if it is in a missionary home for girls, where she would continue to learn and do menial labor. Snook promises to Reverend Crosby that he will have Tillie stay in the MacFarlane home. And Tillie responds really well to this. You know, it's back to your hometown anyway. That's got to be a great relief. And Miss MacFarlane, she was a good woman, a good and wise woman. She became known to the natives of Southeast Alaska as a woman who loves our people. Again, when the Creator needs someone to do something, there they are. And people become Christians in a million different ways, but yet it's always the same. They have these real needs that need to be dealt with, and they're offered a love that has the power to do things. It's not a perfect love, it's offered through imperfect people, but there is hope. And Tillie shows a great aptitude for language. She became a sermon translator. And the funny story about Tillie stopping her translating for Hall Young, who became the missionary in Wrangell, and there was a little mention of the reliability of anthropologists a little in the last session, and you do wrestle with their reliability because you see mistakes in it, and you go, oh, okay. I mean, but the kind of knowledge that you get when you're an anthropologist that comes and spends a couple of summers in a village and asks questions, it's not the best kind of knowledge. You can find out some useful things, but the kind of knowledge that a man like Hall Young, who is a missionary, yes, he has his biases and his purpose, but he's in Wrangell for 10 years, and you get to know people, especially if you are trying to help them in whatever way you can. You see them go through life, and you get a knowledge that the anthropologist can't get. So the funny one about S. Hall Young preaching, it rained 40 days and 40 nights and flooded the whole earth, and Tillie stops translating, and Tillie, why did you stop? I said, well, if I tell the people of Wrangell that this is true, then they'll stop believing you because that happens all the time. But it points up a problem with translation that sometimes people don't realize if you don't do a lot of translating from different cultures. And, there's the sheep and the shepherd thing, we don't need a shepherd here. The sheep don't want them. The mountain goats is the closest thing we got. They don't want that. And then there's the communion thing. One of the rituals in Christianity is that you eat the bread and the wine, the body and blood of your Savior. And cannibalism is wrong, and yet they were accusing Pacific Northwest Coast natives of cannibalism. How do you teach that? How do you translate that? Well, anyway, Tillie, it must have been a real intense learning experience for her, and she responds well and becomes extremely bilingual. Okay, now we'll get to some a little more fun part here, but sorry. I'm getting to the voting part here, but first we have to take a look at Tillie in Sitka, because her husband, Louis Paul, gets killed, and she has her third child on the way. And that's tough in any day and age. Sheldon Jackson comes along again and gives her a place to stay in Sitka. That's Tillie in the back there holding baby Louis. This middle picture, that's Sheldon Jackson in front of her there. And I guess all I'll say about him now is he was short. And that's William Lewis Paul in the white in the middle there. This is also a detail of this larger picture. And his older brother Samuel is holding a hat or something in the side there. And this other picture is a picture of William Lewis Paul. Go to the next slide, which is taken about the same year. It's a blow-up of William, who is standing on the left there. Tillie in the middle, holding Louis and Samuel. Same photography company. Next slide. This is out of the Sitka Archive, an archive which I have not searched out yet. I think the SJS has probably a lot of stuff there, but might have to go up there again and search. There's Tillie on the right there. It's just labeled small group. Next slide. And that's a blow-up of Tillie while she is at Sitka Sheldon Jackson School. Next slide. This one of the problems that I have with the Paul family stuff is that it's kind of, he went through his life rather uniquely. If you want to hear bad stories about Indian boarding schools, boy, you don't have to look very far. They're all over the place, and there are a lot of people here that love Sheldon Jackson School. I mean, there's no denying that it was very influential and mostly good for us. But William Lewis Paul and his brothers also went to Carlisle Indian School way across the nation, which you can get any number of bad stories about. But he comes through the situation, about 3 years he was there, thinking it's the best thing that has ever happened to him. So how does that happen? How do you reconcile those things? Well, it's one of the my ongoing problems. This is from 1945 A&B minutes, which are also from the University of Washington Library. There's, I think it's probably the most complete set of A&B minutes that there is. This is a motion made by Roy Peratrovich and seconded by Paul Sr., that we endorse the SJS plan on raising money. And Paul Sr. added, SJS was mother and father to me. If it wasn't for the friends there, us fatherless children would not have been able to survive. Remember, William Lewis Paul and Tillie go there. He doesn't have a father. Louis Paul I is dead, and he doesn't get a father figure back in his life until William Tamaree comes along, and he's a teenager by then. So, you know how that worked out. One does not realize the value of schooling until deprived of it. This school is the seed of everything good in our midst. That's how he felt about Sheldon Jackson School. Next slide. And there's the house that Tillie grew up in, or that William grew up in. Tillie had her two sons there, and they spent about 12 years in that house. That house has been moved, but it's still right by the Sheldon Jackson School, and Rebecca Poulsen lives there with her two children and her husband. I got to go there last sharing of knowledge. She said, come on in. Come on, I'll show you around. It's pretty much the same. That's William Paul, probably 1968 when he made a trip to Sitka. Next slide. And of course, there's the Tillie Paul Manor, which is also still there, the sort of the first hospital in Sitka before there really was a hospital. And they still have the signs up. Next slide. This is a photograph of Tillie and William back in New York, 1903. I think that was the year he graduated from Carlisle Indian School. It's in the book Mary Lee Davis. Next slide. And we're back to Wrangell. That's the house that William Tamaree built for Tillie. They were married in 1904 with the approval of William Lewis Paul. He said that was all right. It was all right. This is the house where the necklace was returned to Tillie Paul. And how are we doing for time? Well, we're going to finish up with the voting stuff. Oh, there's the interior of the house and all the holy Bibles up there. And next slide. And William Tamaree there and Tillie in their older age. Next slide. Now, this picture is the closest one I have to 1923. That's Tillie sitting on the side of her house. That's Marion, her granddaughter, sitting on her lap and having a good time in the sunshine. The next year, lower it a little bit. Lower it a little bit so we can see the top of the, there. Next year, she got arrested. That's United States of America versus Tillie Paul Tamaree. Her defense lawyer was technically James Wickersham. She was arrested for inciting an Indian to vote. And this is also in the UW library. You can read all the little stuff, it's the bench warrant issued and that sort of thing. Order of dismissal on the bottom there, yep. Next slide. And this is actually probably the more important one because this is who she was inciting to vote. Charlie Jones, Chief Shakes, he got arrested too. And James Wickersham and William L. Paul, I think they put Wickersham's name on there because there was still a little bit of an attitude that if you wanted a good lawyer, you got a white one. And that was still going around. And so William Paul used it. There's William's signature there and the more bench warrant and bail and things there. Next slide. This is the law that Tillie broke. This is from a law book that is part of the William Paul collection that's at my house, a 1915 Alaska Session Laws law book. It's $500 fine, 3 months in jail. Well, that didn't happen. Next slide. And this is the one that Charlie Jones broke. It's shorter, but it's a felony. I always think it's fun to look at the documents because we talk about this story and winning voting rights, but this is the law they broke. This is on the books there. Next slide. And there's Tillie in her old age. Katliud Kataha. How did she survive through all this culture, all this migration coming into the land? Well, if you want to understand that, you have to understand her Christianity. For one, it's, the names on the buildings over across the way, Walter Soboleff, and on the inside, William Lewis Paul, they were Christian men. I mean, Walter was a Presbyterian pastor. William was studied for the ministry before God turned him into a lawyer. So if you want to, you have to understand how the two came together. And I think I'll just close with a Bible verse, which could be a Klingon verse too. It's one of the 10 Commandments. It's honor your father and mother, that you may live long in the land. That's the first commandment that is given with a promise to live long in the land. And it is one of the powerful things that Tlingit also do. It could have been a Klingon law. It's a universal law. It's the truth. We do have the shaman's necklace here, but I didn't want to display it because I don't want to be offensive, and some people are offended at that. But I will be around, and Tillie Paul was not afraid of the necklace. William Paul was not, and he used it as a part of it as a baton. They had that's the way they felt about it. So anyway, I will just close with that, and you can come up and talk to me. How much time do we have? 15 minutes before they have to start setting up, something like that. Dinner tonight. Thank you very much. I have neglected to introduce all the members of the Paul family here. They deserve it, I guess. There's 3 children of Fred Paul, also a lawyer, and that's Blair Paul, Mike Paul, and Nina. If you're going to talk to them, they'll talk your ear off. But greet them nicely. You have been greeting them very nicely for the whole weekend here. So this is their first Sharing of Knowledge conference, and Jean Gamache is here, another Paul family member, with Cindy DeWitt next to him, and Mita DeWitt.
You heard mention of Chief Charlie Jones.
Charlie Jones, right.
We're all connected.
And we just have one Tamaree here, I think. Oh, Jacqueline. Oh, there's Jacqueline. Hi, Jacqueline. She's my best friend. No, it's Deborah. Deborah O'Gara is my best friend, and we're all spend the next year. I got Mita. Hi, Mita. Oh, I have a son back here, too. He was doing the Kook Klin, big box. Sometimes goes by the name of Jared, but and I'm a little proud of Deborah O'Gara because she's a judge now, and she moved out of Douglas just this year and up to Petersburg, so you won't see her around town so much, but we love her. She's also the caretaker of our Teton Raven hats, so she stood up and sat down again, and thanks.